All right, today we are looking at the Hebrews and the Kingdom of Israel, and kind of looking at the earlier periods and the stories behind that structure and shape the identity of the Hebrew people as it transitions to an actual kingdom, and then, of course, monotheism, which is central to several different religions to this day. So, one of the things that comes up with this from the very beginning is looking at understanding how to read the primary sources that were left behind, which are made up from the Torah, from the Old Testament, and the Bible today. Those are primary sources that we can read to understand their religious views, their law codes, their view of history. But I think especially important to understand if you're reading anything in the context of the historical documents, the historical leaning documents in terms of what the Hebrews wrote, the Israelites wrote as their history, because there's things in the Old Testament, that books of the Bible, if you will, that are their history. They wrote it for history. And this is one of the first cases too where we see in the ancient world of a clear understanding of history and the importance of recording history. So we'll talk about that too, and how that influences, even to this day, somewhat our view of how you look at history. But again, if you're going to dive into trying to look at these primary sources and say, how do we understand who the Hebrew people were? What are their religious beliefs, their law codes? How did it transition to the kingdom of Israel? How did they view these events? You have to understand how they viewed history. And the purpose of what they were writing. And this is good. This is good for any primary source. I tend to emphasize it here more because there's always more contention with the Bible as a historical document. Usually that's because it's still connected to a practicing religion. And so people immediately go to looking at, is it historically accurate, and trying to prove yes or no on that front, rather than just looking at it as a primary source. It's a historical document, and we're going to look at it that way. And this is the same kind of techniques you would use for other ones that people kind of do subconsciously and don't think about it because it's not so much tied to current religious beliefs that give it somewhat of a more heated element to it, I think. So what we're going to look at first is kind of the purpose of their history. Okay, specifically, what were they doing, right? So, and this is then in writing down events, like battles, stories, etc., right? And these are things that we find in the Torah and the Old Testament. And so looking at, okay, what was the purpose of how they wrote these down, right? For example, to give you one out of context, the Assyrians, they wrote down, they didn't have the same clear-cut view of history. So that's an important distinction. But they wrote down on their palace walls all of their conquests because that's what was important to them, who they conquered, what they looted. Right? So that gives us a really good indication of the value in that society based on what they thought was most important to record and write down. Same thing. What's the value of this society, right? What is it that they cared to write down about their history, so much so that they felt it was necessary to keep record of it? Well, the main structure was essentially to teach the Israelites about the covenant with God. And the covenant with God was really central to their identity and structure. So the covenant is just an agreement or a binding oath. And so the covenant with God is, let's see here, we'll put it over here, a contract or promise between two people. Could be more, right? In this case, right, that's God and the Israelites. So at least two people, right? This is more people. Or the Hebrews. It actually starts with the Hebrews. The Hebrews, it shifts to the Israelites when it shifts to the kingdom of Israel. So it actually starts with God and Hebrews. And so this would be specifically to showcase, right, that covenant with God. That was one of their main goals, is to write down events to showcase the covenant. And the covenant was connected to this idea that if God's saying, right, if you worship, so let's put it here like this. So God's saying, if you worship me, and are faithful to me, not men, to me, then, right, so that's the if, then it's then I will help you and protect you. Right. It also gets connected to the idea of the Israelites as the chosen people of God. Right. So it was meant to show that they were favored, that they were chosen by God, and then that's reinforced by showcasing the covenant. And then also to show how God had been faithful to them. Okay, so that's kind of the purpose, right, of writing their history. But now it also gets to how they viewed history. We'll say how. We'll ask the question. How did they view history? And again, this does go back to the covenant again that we have over there. It was a belief that historical events and consequences, right, are a direct action of either following the covenant of God or failing to follow the covenant of God. So historical events and consequences were a direct result of following the covenant or not following it. Okay, so their whole system was set, or their whole point of history was set around showing this, because they definitely were some of the first to see history in terms of a linear fashion. And this is important because we saw that, like, with, Egypt, the belief that you could just chisel out someone's name and that they don't exist anymore. They never happened. Instead, you have now history as a linear thing that's moving forward in time. And past actions, like recognizing and understanding past actions, influence your present situation, right? And we still think this today. So the idea that, we see history to this day as a linear fashion of the things in the past that happened are important to know because it helps you understand where we are today. And that is very much a new concept in the ancient world. to want to study that, to want to pay attention to it. And again, it goes back to understanding the covenant of God, because they had a purpose and a reason for showing this type of history, right? They wanted to show for people in the future, right, that if you, they basically wanted to show what happens if you follow the covenant. And so they wrote about events that they interpreted that where they followed the covenant, and then they showed how good things came from that. They also intentionally wrote about what happens when you don't follow the covenant. And so they picked events, and when you didn't follow the covenant, bad things happened. Right? And so this what happened here too. Right? This is how you understand when you're reading their history. When you're reading the primary sources that they wrote about their history, you have to look at it from this lens. Because that's how they viewed it. That's what they chose to write. So to give you an example, there is a battle with the Assyrians. It comes later in time period after the kingdom is divided. But the Assyrians attack. We have records from the Assyrians and recording what happened in vague terms as the Assyrians did, but they still recorded some of the events. And then we have from that same battle, the Israelites writing down their interpretation of events. The first time the Assyrians attack, they end up getting sick, and there's a sickness that kind of spreads through the camp. And so they're forced to actually retreat and leave. And they wrote that basically that's kind of what they wrote, is that they were attacking the Israelites, and before they were able to breach the walls and take them, that the too many soldiers fell sick, and so they left. The Israelites wrote that the Assyrians were attacking, and then they fell sick, but the reason they fell sick in their understanding was because God had that happen, because they had been faithful, because they'd followed the covenant. God had sent the sickness to the Assyrians to have them prosper over the Assyrians. The Assyrians come back later and then take them, which also then would have been interpreted if there were people still around from that group that they had failed to follow the covenant, and that was the consequence. So they intentionally wrote down both the good things they did as they saw them, as well as the bad things, to show people like, look, here, learn from our mistakes, which is part of that linear fashion, the idea that you can learn from your mistakes, right? See what happens when we follow the covenant, good things happen. See what happens when we fail to follow the covenant, bad things happen, right? And hopefully you learn from that and stop not following the covenant, because in how they've portrayed the historical aspects, to them it's this very much this laid out plan of, look, every time we fail to follow the covenant, bad things happen. So really we should stop doing that. But that then helps you better understand their society going in by understanding this view of history. And so that's the purpose, that's the reason. So now let's look at, put 2 here, kind of the origins. This first part is not something we can prove historically. Well, there's a few things, and I'll clarify which we can and which we can't. A lot of this is oral tradition that was passed down in stories, and here, so myths and legend. In the extra credit reading on how to read the Bible packet, where you can then answer the questions and turn that in for extra credit, it talks about this in there with myth and legend, and the idea that, right, with oral tradition, the tales and stories of which going to be the founders of, or the patriarchs as it's called, but the father, figures, the founders of the Hebrews, about their lives and the stories and tales, right? And this is not, we'll put here, we don't have 100% historical proof or evidence, right? A lot of this is just, stories about individuals that we're never going to know whether they existed. We're not going to be able to prove definitively unless some crazy archaeological thing comes up where it proves it, right? However, you can also look at culture, traditions, and other things that are connected to the time period that supposedly this took place. So we're going to talk about that and where it fits in with like Mesopotamian culture and things like that, as well as just some of the stories, because ultimately these are oral traditions, the founding patriarchs and their stories leading up to where when we finally have historical records, establishes Hebrew identity. So it's important if you want to understand the culture, right, you need to know at least the background of this information in their stories so that you understand. Just like we looked at the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Not looking at it as a historical thing of whether Gilgamesh was an actual king. There's some suggestion he might have been. Do we think that the whole story is? No. But you can understand Mesopotamian outlook on life by reading the Epic of Gilgamesh. Likewise, by understanding these oral traditions and tales of the patriarchs and the background of how the Hebrews came to establish their identity, it gives us a ton of information about them. So the oral tradition, as I mentioned, one thing we do know is that the region where they came from was Mesopotamia. In fact, Abraham, they think, if he was a real person, at least how it's described, came from Ur, right, in southern Mesopotamia. So, and even if he didn't actually exist, all of the cultural stuff that they talk about, right, the oral traditions are oral until they get written down, but they're passed around orally for hundreds of years before they're actually written down. But what's written down is many, many years after Mesopotamia, and part of the early period of Mesopotamia. And yet has a lot of cultural similarities that are accurate with Mesopotamian culture. So this is one of those things where it's probably safe to assume that based on the fact that you have all these kind of stories that keep over and over reflecting different aspects of Mesopotamian culture, and we'll look at those in a second, that's probably the accurate location of where they originated from. They move around quite a bit. Because we also know that they were semi-nomadic sheep herders. Okay, so these things, are historical things that we are pretty confident about, right? The specifics of the specific patriarchs, right, less so. So you have a lot of the early stories after the creation epic. I guess I could put that here just so we have it, right? Just like we talked about with Mesopotamia and their creation stories, you have the creation epic or creation story. Then you have the story of the patriarchs. And these are the founding fathers of the Hebrews. And so this is, let's see, right, Abraham, Isaac, and these are all family members generationally, Joseph, Jacob, etc. Right? This is eventually they're going to lead to how the Hebrews are going to trace their lineage, is that these are the founding fathers, and through their line becomes the 12 tribes of Israel. So again, why is it important? Well, because they identify their tribes to these people. Whether or not, right, that there was an actual Isaac or Joseph historically isn't as important as the story itself. because it establishes what the values of that society. That's what legend does, right? Myth and legend, I'm talking about that. Legend, and let's look at that for a second, right? Because let's look at that one part here. So if we go down to, and this is the extra credit option, it talks about legend here, right? So legend, and I realized I gave you guys one that already had some markings that will help you answer the question. So legend, right? Containing here and there accurate memories of a tradition, but preserving these memories in writing produced many years after the events they purport to describe. Writings designed to dramatize the convictions held by the Hebrew people concerning God's activities and human affairs. This is with heroes too, right? The life of the hero embodies the struggles of a nation or a group to achieve greatness. Right? That it essentially then gives us a sense of what's important, right? And it says here, right, the actual existence of the patriarchs and others cannot be proven or disproven, but instead treated as legend, and recognizing that the legend is what it's doing is that it is giving us what was important to the people at the time, right? Here's the purpose of the legend. Legends are important not merely because they may contain accurate data, which a lot do. Like we found, like I said, for example, the best connection to this, I think, is like the Odyssey and the Iliad, specifically the Iliad with the Trojan War. For the longest time, historians thought it was all myth and legend. And then they discovered archaeological evidence to prove that the Battle of Troy happened. Does that mean the entire Iliad is a historically accurate text? No. What it does mean is that a lot of times we should take legend seriously in the sense, not literally, but seriously in the sense that it probably was rooted in something that actually was true, right? Not merely because it may contain accurate data, but because they provide us with an appreciation of the way in which people thought and an understanding of what they believed at the time the legend was recorded. Legend belongs in the history of human thought. It tells us what was important with that society. They thought this was important enough to represent the values of their society, to share the story over and over again. It resonated with them, and pass it on and eventually write it down. Right? So legends should always be taken seriously from cultures because it tells us so much about the cultural, religious, political aspects and beliefs that they held, that they valued and thought were important. Also, because oftentimes there's some kernels of truth in legends. We've seen it over and over again in history. Things that were initially assumed to be 100%, narrative, myth, legend, only to then see that there were aspects, never the whole thing, but aspects of events that did happen. And more importantly, though, than even that, is that it tells us what that society valued, what they thought was important, what the legends and myths tend to showcase and highlight the values of a society at the time. So you could look at, well, like, what are our myths, what are our narratives, and what does that say about our society and what we value? And you can do this with any society. Just find out what their myths and legends and stories were that were important enough not only to be told over and over again for hundreds of years orally, but then also written down and preserved, right? That showcases it. A story that gets forgotten after 5 years, that's not a legend, right? Or a myth. But these ones that endure over time and centuries to still be an important part of that culture, those are valuable. And so that's what this is getting at here within that extra credit reading that you have. Okay, so the patriarchs, we know, like I said, around Mesopotamia, semi-nomadic sheep herders, give you the names of some, and there's stories about each of these characters and kind of the trials and tribulations that they go through. One of the important things with Abraham is actually he has technically the first covenant with God. Just him, though. And I guess it's kind of for his family, which then leads to the people. The second covenant is for everyone. And this was circumcision. Circumcision as the act of sealing the covenant, if you will. But that God and Abraham, Abraham agrees to follow God, and in order to prove that loyalty, he circumcises himself because God asks him to, right? And so that technically is as an adult, which would be very painful. But that's the first covenant, right? And Abraham then is that founding father, and his children and his children's children become the founders of the tribes. You also have, during this period of the kind of oral tradition that eventually gets written down, are the law codes. And we'll look at those a little bit more in just a second. But there's definitely Mesopotamia or Hammurabi law code components, a similarity to Hammurabi's law codes. Okay, they're not exactly the same. We'll come back to that. You also have the flood narrative. And as we saw in Gilgamesh, and the other one I think I just briefly mentioned, Atrahasis, right? These are both Mesopotamian ones. These also contain flood narratives that are similar. They're not identical, but it is interesting that you have that, and which again makes sense if there was this overarching flood narrative in Mesopotamia, that the Hebrews would have it as well. You also have similar. There's stories, right? For example, Moses and his birth, right, is also similar to Sargon's birth. Moses is in danger as a baby because this is during the period when the Israelites are slaves in their stories, their histories as to the Egyptians, and the Pharaoh orders all babies or boys, firstborn boys of a certain age and under, killed. Moses' mother puts him in a reed basket and floats him down the Nile to try to save him. The princess or queen finds him and then raises him as her own. And he is raised as an Egyptian prince until later discovering his own identity and then coming back, fleeing, and then coming back to free his people. Sargon was put into a basket and floated down the river. Romulus and Remus, who are the founding twins of the city of Rome, were put in a basket and floated down a river. So it's a common trope and use for the hero quest in literature. But we see, right, really close time period together that this is used. Sargon has the story. The Hebrews have the story with Moses. You also have similarities in the Songs of Solomon, which are similar to New Kingdom and Egypt, right, poetry. So that you can clearly see that there is influence by these sources, which would suggest that they are from that time period and area, right? It's not necessarily going to prove anything in terms of the people that they're talking about, but there's enough similarities of cultural similarities and practices and customs to suggest that they are from the area of Mesopotamia around the time period of what we were looking at with Mesopotamia, with Egypt, that they definitely were present during that time. There's too much similarity for it to be made up that they came from a completely different region, right? So those are important things just to understand that way and understanding that context of that. And where they could get the connection to Egypt, well, this might, one, Mesopotamia traded with Egypt, but the other thing is there is some suggestion, right? The stories talk about the Exodus and escape from Egypt. There was a period here, let's put it under here, where you had a drought in Mesopotamia. There was many years of drought, and this took place during the second intermediate period in Egypt. And Egypt had actually stored up, we looked at the redistributive system, right? And they'd stored up a lot of grain. People went to Egypt to buy grain. So there is some suggestion, and this isn't proved one way or the other in terms of, we do know this, that people went to Egypt to buy grain during this period of drought. And Mesopotamians went there. There is some suggestion that this could have been when some Hebrew tribes moved to Egypt. And then if you're looking for if there is a possible time period where there was a small group that were enslaved, certainly not in massive numbers like is talked about, when the new kingdom took over, they enslaved some people. But again, Egypt never had massive slaves like it's kind of described in the Bible. But this would connect within Moses and the Ten Commandments in that time period. So it's possible that way. The Egyptians didn't record a lot about slavery and the use of slaves. And not surprisingly, it probably would have been seen as a non-event. There's no reason why the Egyptians would have written about specifically a specific group of slaves. And if there really was a revolt and the Hebrews escaped, it's not likely something the Egyptians would have written down anyway, because they tried to keep their, what they did record is the positives of the strong pharaoh that's, a good warrior, or in the previous ones, maintaining Mot. So they're not going to record these events where they lose, at least not in this circumstance. But again, so this just shows the connection, how we know that there's obviously connection, there's obviously influence in that. Let's look at the law codes, because I do want to, so we'll write them again here. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so the law codes. There's 3 sections to the law codes. You have the moral, which is the 10 Commandments, right? And we'll look at that in a second, that how to live, how to follow God. Then you have the civil, and these are like Hammurabi's law codes. And if I had put up and taken some law codes from Hammurabi and from the Hebrews, and I didn't specify which is which, you probably wouldn't be able to identify them, because they were reactive, right? Just like Hammurabi's codes, they dealt with stealing, they dealt with slaves, they dealt with women, and there was both clearly a patriarchal structure as well as some protection. And virginity was more emphasized here than in Mesopotamia. And so you have both. It was clearly patriarchal structure, and women were very much under that. But there were some law codes that looked very much like Mesopotamians' law codes about protection. They also, and then just the day-to-day stuff: stealing, farming, agriculture, and responsibility as a farmer. Later as a sheep herder, if your animals run off, things like that. So very, very similar, reactive, you really wouldn't be able to tell a lot of them apart. And then you have Levitical. And Levitical law codes are the rules for the temple and the priests. So because they were semi-nomadic, their temple, they tore it down and then rebuilt it up as they moved to places. And so they had very specific rules about how you took it down, how you built it, the layout and structure, who could go where, and all of those things. And that then eventually then housed the Ten Commandments in the temple, even how you could clean it. And so these were the laws and rules for the priest. I'm sure other people look at it occasionally, but it was mostly for a very specific group of people. But these were laws that they were supposed to follow. Right? It wasn't just here's suggestions. These were very much the rules of what you were required to do on, in some cases, the penalty of death. So, like I said, the law codes then have the kind of three parts to it. In that structure. So let's look at, actually, let me talk about the one other part, and then we'll look at the primary source for that. So let's see. Let's put C. We'll do Exodus as its own thing, because it's central to, one, it's the second covenant, but the most inclusive. Right? The first covenant is with Abraham. This covenant is going to be with everyone. And this establishes a clear Hebrew identity. So it is important to understand the Exodus and what it means to them, because this was what established the Hebrew identity and their religion. Right, so it's connected to the Hebrews as slaves of Egypt and Moses freeing them. And I'm not going to get into the whole story with that outside of, right, Moses comes back. He had been a prince of Egypt. He discovers his identity, flees, meets up with his people. God comes and speaks to him, tells him he has to go back and free his people. He's like, I don't really want to. God's like, you don't really have a choice. And then he goes back with Aaron, and they go and they tell the Pharaoh, you need to let the people go. The Pharaoh refuses, and a whole bunch of bad things happen to the Egyptians until finally the Pharaoh lets them go, only as they're leaving to change his mind to try to chase them down. This is then where Moses, through God, parts the Red Sea. The Hebrews make it across. As the Egyptians go on the riverbed, though, it closes over them. And then they're free. So then they're celebrating, and Moses, at this point, is given the Ten Commandments. He goes up on a mountain or hill while the people are celebrating below. He's there for a couple days. He gets the Ten Commandments, comes back down to find that they had melted down whatever they had and built an idol out of it. He gets so pissed, he breaks the Ten Commandments and then has to go back up and ask God for another set. This is also the reason why then they have to wander the desert for 40 plus years, is because they immediately turned away from God. But the Ten Commandments then are the covenant with God. And it gets connected specifically to, and this is where their identity part is, right? This is repeated over and over again. I am the Lord your God, and the one who brought you out of Egypt. where you were slaves. And we'll see in the primary sources here in just a second, right? This is mentioned over and over again. Because of this, right, that's the idea. Because of this of freeing you, right, then here are the laws and expectations that I want you to follow. And so then the people agree, right, to be the chosen people of God and follow the laws, the 10 Commandments, and follow God. And then it kicks back to the other part of the covenant that I mentioned, right? That if you follow the covenant, good things happen. If you fail to follow the covenant, bad things happen. But this is the identity part of it. And we'll see, like I said, in the primary source, it's mentioned, this statement in various ways is mentioned over and over again. I'm God, I freed you from Egypt, you were slaves there, and you're free because of me. Right? So you once were slaves and now you're free. That's because of God. And so that's then the catalyst for the covenant. That's the catalyst is identifying as a Hebrew people. It's the catalyst for their religious beliefs. So it is central to everything about them as a people, right? Whether or not the Exodus actually was an actual historical event isn't so relevant in terms of understanding them and how they understand themselves. Right, that they saw this as an event that was super important and happened. But again, historically, if we're trying to understand the culture and the religion, this is an important event because of that. Because of how they identify it and because they connected it, right? Because ultimately you get this idea of that domino effect, right? So Egypt and slavery, we'll put right as one. Then it moves to, God saves the Hebrews. Then you have establishes the 10 Commandments because God saved them, right? Here are the law codes for you to follow. This creates the Hebrew identity. And religion or religious identity beliefs. And then this leads to the kingdom of Israel, centered around those events. Now there's going to be the judges period in between, but which we'll talk about in just a second, but that's that key structural period, right? So this is why that's important. So let's look at the source where we can see this covenant, where we can see this mentioned, and then we'll talk about the judges period. All right, let's see here. So we have the primary sources from the Torah. You have the 10 Commandments here. And then we'll look at the covenant with God, and it's mentioned in the next part. But here's the first part, right? I am the Lord your God, the one who brought you out of Egypt, where you were slaves. So this statement in a variety of forms is mentioned lots of times, which again shows the significance of it because it's littered throughout. I only have, 2 small examples here. And it's in there, and it's in many, many other places in the various, in the Torah and the books of the Bible and the Old Testament. So this list, right, the 10 Commandments, do not worship any other God except me. One, this is going to get into, and don't make idols that look like anything, but this is where we're going to get into monotheism. And we will talk about this in when we're done with the historical or political social aspects of it. So monotheism, right? Mono. So you have one God versus poly, right? Multiple. Polytheism is multiple gods. Monotheism is one God. And so that is one of the distinctions with the Hebrews, is the development of monotheism. When you really look at most of what's going on in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the ancient world, is polytheistic religions. And we'll see with the Persians, Zoroastrianism is unique as well in that case. But those are kind of the first two groups that have very different kind of religious directions, and yet there's some similarities here as well. So we'll come back to this and talk about that when we talk about monotheism. Right now we're just looking at it from like the law codes here and the covenant. So don't worship any god except me. Do not misuse my name. Respect your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not tell lies. These ones here, right, we're not going to talk about every single one, but the point with these, right, is that these are not reactive. These are not specific. These are general, overarching rules, right? Not, don't murder someone with a knife when you're angry and they are your neighbor. That's reactive. Super specific to a specific event that kept happening, that the king had to deal with and issue an edict. Here, it's just don't steal, don't murder, and you don't have like a punishment attached to it. You don't have a specific explanation of what type of stealing, what type of theft, right? It's just a general overarching rule. That's the Ten Commandments, and it's very much connected to, right, that these are the agreements that you made to be God's people, chosen people. Right? You're God's chosen people, and in following God, these are the rules that are set in place to maintain that covenant. When that covenant is followed, then good things happen. So that's one of the significance of the Ten Commandments, besides being a moral code, which is unique in the law codes of having a very clear cut, here's the moral laws that we've set in place for you to live by. So, right, which I guess that's in that, but you have the moral code component. You also then have the covenant with God requirements, we'll say, right? Here's what you agree to do by being God's chosen people. Oops. So now let's look at, right, gotta go off of that for a second, or just go down on here. There we go. I always forget where to move it versus writing. So then you have from the book of Leviticus, this does a good job of showcasing the covenant with God. So faithfully obey my laws, and I will send rain to make your crops grow and your trees produce fruit. Your harvest of your grain and grapes will be so abundant that you won't know what to do with it all. You will eat and be satisfied, and you will live in safety. I will bless your country with peace, and you will rest without fear. Here again, right? I am the Lord your God, and I rescued you from Egypt so that you would never again be slaves. I have set you free. Now walk with your heads held high. So this is the positive, right? This is if you follow the covenant. You follow the covenant, good things happen. However, this here is going to be, did not follow the covenant, and consequently it's negative things that happen. If you disobey me and my laws, and if you break our agreement, right, that's the covenant, I will punish you terribly, and you will be ruined. You will be struck with incurable diseases and with fever that leads to blindness and depression. Your enemies will eat the crops you plant, and I will turn from you and let you be destroyed by your attackers. You will even run at the very rumor of attack. Then if you still refuse to obey me, I will punish you 7 times for each of your sins until your pride is completely crushed. I will hold back the rain, right, and there'll be no harvest. Suppose then you realize, so there's like a not following the covenant, and then if you're still stubborn and you continue to refuse the covenant, then there's worse consequences, right? But then it says, then suppose you realize that I turned against you and brought you to the land of your enemies because both you and your ancestors had stubbornly sinned against me. If you humbly confess what you have done and start living right, I'll keep the promises I made to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will bless your land and let it rest during the time you are in a foreign country, paying for your rebellion against me. So that there is redemption. And we're going to come back to this part. So I don't want to get too far into it, other than, because we're going to talk about it within terms of some of the unique aspects of the religion. But the idea that there is redemption from breaking the covenant. It's not like you broke the covenant and now you're screwed and there is no way to come back from that. Right? And no matter what you have done, I am still the Lord your God, and I will never completely reject you or become absolutely disgusted with you. Right? While nations watched, I rescued your ancestors from Egypt so that I would be their God. Yes, I am the Lord, and I will never forget our agreement. So again, twice in this short page, we have reference to Egypt and freeing of slaves. And then you also have a very clearly set out, defined system of here's the good things that happen if you follow the covenant. Here are the bad things that happen if you follow and then continue to not follow. Sorry, here's the bad things that happen if you don't follow the covenant. And then if you continue to not follow it, here's the even worse things. But you can be redeemed. There is redemption, and you'll never be completely rejected or forgotten by God. Okay, so this is like, that's why I picked this one here, because I think it's a great way of showing and how they believed and saw the covenant. All right, so let's go to the Judges period. What happens is that you have a shift from semi-nomadic to sedentary life, where they settle down and move towards agriculture. This then is what the Judges period is, a confederacy of settled Hebrew tribes, which were made up of the 12 tribes. So the best way to think of this are kind of like semi-independent city-states. Like each tribe was kind of their own city-state. Not as completely independent as Mesopotamia or Greece when we get to them. They were independent city-states because they were more interconnected because of their religion and those beliefs. But they still were independent in certain ways. So each tribe was essentially like an independent city-state or the best is semi-independent city-state. And why the Judges period is because during this period, you had usually elders. I guess it didn't have to be, but usually elders of each of the 12 tribes would be chosen or elected as judge. So one person from each tribe. Right, and then these were the judges. They made the decisions for the group as a whole. They voted on laws, warfare, anything that involved the tribes as a whole, right? Because obviously individual tribes still had some autonomy, not as well as a whole. So this wasn't like they dictated and controlled everything, but when there was this need for joint action, and that's why I said it's semi-independent, because they weren't fully independent, because they had this kind of cohesive system of laws, cohesive system of rule and practices and warfare, that they were collective in that sense. And yet each tribe had their own kind of independent cultures and customs and practices that they also did that were different from tribe to tribe. And so this, right, you get essentially the local level of all of that we looked at would be the individual tribe. And then at the, with the confederation, right, that would be the judges. This is the last one where we see similarities to Mesopotamia. So again, hopefully with the government structure, you'll see Mesopotamia. This is what's interesting, right? When they shift to the kingdom, the cultural similarities and practices of Mesopotamia that we've been talking about up to this point go away. I mean, the law codes stay. They don't get rid of those. But a lot of these practices and the stories and those, they really become a very different people when it shifts to the kingdom of Israel. So where is this similar? Well, in the government structure. Let me put that. Specifically with the Council of Elders and the General Assembly, right? You have, think of the Council of Elders, and then the fact that this group, they elected an N, and then you had the Council of Nippur, which met for, this was an N from each city-state was elected to be the representative to meet. So if there was regional issues, like, hey, Mesopotamia, multiple city-states are under threat of invasion, or this flooding, or this drought, then each city-state in Mesopotamia would elect it an N, so like, right, to represent them. And then they would all meet, the N's from the various city-states would meet, and they could make unilateral decisions or joint decisions for the city-states as a group when necessary. So the judges period kind of reflects both the Council of Elders, General Assembly with the N electing the N's in times of need, and as well as the Council of Nippur, and like each judge was essentially like an N. They weren't dictators like the N in terms of they couldn't make unilateral decisions. They, because you had 12 of them that all had to agree. So in that way, like I said, the Council of Nippur is probably the closest to it, but it has, like I said, these similarities to this structure. So why does it change, right? So the next one is so that lasts for a little over 200 years, the judges period, right? And this is that's their political structure. Why does it change? Why do we get then the kingdom of Israel? So there's a couple reasons why there is this shift to the kingdom, which is very short, by the way. It's like 3 kings. So one is going to be warfare, and the other is going to be that 1200 BCE date, right? This gives them the opening in power and control in the region to be independent. Remember what happens in around 1200. Again, 1200 is just the easy collective date around, probably more like 1177, but doesn't matter. 1200 BCE, right? We're using that date as kind of that generalized time frame. All major societies, civilizations collapsed in the region. Mesopotamia, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, the Mycenaeans, everything collapses. And we talked about the reasons. You have drought, overpopulation, sea peoples, inland raiders, natural disasters, and some other things like that. All which led to instability and the difficulty in maintaining large empires, so that they collapsed in their level of control. This left a massive vacuum of power that gave an opening to the Hebrews. Them and the Phoenicians, they were the 2 groups that benefited from 1200 BCE. Because they were able to become independent nations and otherwise would not have. both of the Phoenicians as well. Like the only reason you get a kingdom of Israel that's independent is because of this 1200 BC period. As soon as the nations recover, as soon as these civilizations begin to recover, surprise, surprise, they take them over and the kingdom of Israel disappears as an independent nation. It's still going to come out surviving miraculously enough with the Persians, but they're not independent. They become a tributary state and they stay that way. This is kind of why it's so short, and they also have internal problems and are going to divide at the worst possible time to do so. But so they don't last very long on their own independently as a united kingdom. But then even as two kingdoms, that they just can't sustain independence with these much larger civilizations that are then regaining control and immediately look to conquer and take over them, because they're kind of in the middle of everything. I mean, they're off to the side a little bit, but they're still within that region of where all these other empires are, and they're just not strong enough to maintain it. So it's a super important date, right? 1200 BCE is important for what it does, what we already talked about with the Assyrians and everything else. And then on top of that, it's important because it is this date that makes the kingdom of Israel possible. And then warfare, right? The constant warfare with the judges structure is, we'll say, difficult. We saw this, right? Why did Mesopotamia shift to kingship? Because of constant warfare. And then it's easier to have one individual making decisions. Same exact reason. They end up in constant warfare with the Philistines, which was a neighboring group of people in the region. And the judges is just ineffective. You ultimately have to, like, oh, we need to debate. Now we need to have a council. Now we have to have a vote. And by the time you do all that, oh, you've been taken over. Then there's no need for you anymore. That's why the Mesopotamians had the inn, excuse me, that they could elect, because they needed sometimes someone to rapidly make decisions. Well, the judges eventually realized that with the constant warfare, it was ineffective the way their system was running. And so then they looked to install a king, right? That gets you to kingship for the very specific purpose of defeating the Philistines. Right? It was really about how do we make sure that we defeat them and are successful and end this conflict. So the very first king that they picked, so it's going to be, they're not going to pick all of the kings, but Saul, so the first king was actually chosen. So Mesopotamian kingship was more organic, where the ends kind of took over and then eventually established themselves as rulers. Here, it was a conscious decision by the judges to select a king, which then, of course, they wrote down and recorded as God told them to, and then that the first king was anointed by God. Saul was the first king. This is around 1051 to 1011 BCE, circa that. Why he was chosen? Here, let's put that. So we'll put why. Well, he was charismatic, which is always a good aspect in a king. If you can charm, if you can be friendly. He was a soldier who was supposed to be a good soldier, although he doesn't have much success in defeating the Philistines. He was supposedly a foot taller than most people, right? So if you're trying to find a good, strong military leader that's going to, because this is all, right, military based, even the charismatic, that's going to make a good military leader that people are going to want to follow. And if you're bigger than everyone else, then you look strong and tough, and you must be a good soldier if you're bigger than everyone else, which is not true, but it looks impressive. That, if you're going up against someone tiny versus someone who's larger, you're going to be more intimidating. So this was seen, right? His purpose was to defeat the Philistines. That's why he was elected as king. He didn't, so what was significant about Saul, of course, is that then this unites the tribes into a unified kingdom. Although they're going to still have issues with that throughout the short period. Saul spent his whole rule fighting. And ultimately, there were problems, specifically both the fact that he could not defeat the Philistines, the enemy. Oops. And there were internal conflicts, specifically with the various tribes and arguments over favoritism, and then David, who becomes the next king. Now, David was not Saul's son, Jonathan was, and Saul fully intended Jonathan to become king, but Jonathan ends up dying, and then Saul dies as well. But how that happens is that you have David enter the mix, and David then is the next king of Israel. 1011 to 971. There's various stories, so let's establish that first. There's various stories about David, and in fact, he worked for Saul. He was a shepherd, and then later worked for Saul as a cupbearer, and occasionally played music as well. But the most famous story with him is David and Goliath. And this story is a great example of showing the covenant with God. It was also used to explain Saul losing favor with God, and that transferring to David to justify and explain why he becomes king next. And David, by the way, was super popular. And we'll talk about the other stuff he did in just a minute. So let me talk about the story of David and Goliath. David and Goliath. So the traditional story is that David was a young shepherd, a kid, a teenager, and his brothers were all older and in the military, and Saul fighting the Philistines. And he would visit to drop off meals and see them. And he's often described as kind of a little bit of an annoying kid. Anyway, the Philistines offer a champion. Now, this is something that we know various ancient civilizations did during warfare. It was a way to save lives. You'd offer a fight between your champions. Each side would put their champion forth, and the champions would fight, and that would determine the battle. Thus, instead of, hundreds of people dying, one person died. And then they agreed to, honor who won. So this is definitely something that was common in the ancient world. It didn't happen every battle, not by a long shot, but it wasn't something that was unheard of. The Philistines offer Goliath, and Goliath's described as a giant, probably just larger than most men, but he was described as this giant. And the king of the Philistines was taunting the Israelites, and no one wanted to fight the big guy. Until one day David saw that their God was being insulted by the Philistines, and no one was responding, so he said he would go fight. Saul tries to give him his armor, but it's too big for him, so he just goes down with his sling. And slings were used by shepherds to fight off lions and other things that would eat the sheep or goats. These type of slings aren't like the Y-shaped sling. Instead, it's kind of longer. So I think like the Americanized slings, are like this, where then you have it pulled back and it shoots, right? This they did not use. Instead, it's this sling that goes like that, and it has a spot where you'd put the rock, and then you have the sides, and then this can swing around and throw the rock. And I mean, this could kill things. That's why they used it as a defense against, lions and other animals and stuff when they were defending. Anyway, then he takes his sling. He doesn't have any armor. Everyone, laughs at it, and then he ends up killing or hitting Goliath in the head perfectly, which knocks him out, and then he cuts off his head. And so it's meant to showcase the faith that David had in God, and following the covenant of God, where everyone else was too afraid to do anything about it. It's also meant to show the moment that Saul kind of loses God's favor and anointment, and David instead is kind of meant to be the next king. So there's multiple purposes for it. Historically, what they think actually happened is the other story that's talked about. David was in his 30s and was a mercenary, and he did work for Saul for a while, and they had a falling out because David was super popular. David fled and ends up working as a mercenary, even fighting for the Philistines for a period in time, and then comes back as a hardened soldier and defeats Goliath. That's much more likely what actually happened. But so again, here's where understanding why they do the things they do for their history is helpful. Why have the other story be the one that's emphasized the most? Because it works best to showcase the covenant with God. The other one doesn't as much. And so that makes sense that would be the one that's highlighted, that's emphasized, and the other one's kind of just glossed over, because that is a better story for showcasing that. Okay, so that ultimately, though, Jonathan dies in battle, not against David. They were at least in the stories, friends, but either way, he died in warfare, in battle, and then Saul is killed. And so this, because Saul didn't like David because he ultimately felt threatened by David, and I suppose rightfully so, considering David becomes king. But David was always was super popular, and he's described as the one with God's heart, which again is to showcase that covenant. Right, that David is marked in their history as fulfilling that covenant, being faithful to God, and even with his other issues and mistakes, doesn't ever lose that in their popular history. One of the things that from the beginning was problematic is there was always tensions between the tribe of Judah, which is what David and Saul had come from, and some of the other tribes, and there was arguments with Saul of favoritism and all of that. So he did something smart. He conquered Jerusalem, what made Jerusalem. He conquered the area that became Jerusalem, and made that the capital. Which was kind of central. So this was, if you pretend this is the map here, you had the tribe of Judah. There were two tribes in this, and then you had the other tribes. There were 10. Well, this is going to reflect what's going to how it's going to split. And anyway, there was lots of argument of favoritism. So Jerusalem ends up being here, kind of right in the center, and it wasn't part of their territory. And David ends up taking that and then making that so that he can argue, right, that he's not showing favoritism at all, and rather as being equal. And this holds through David and his son Solomon. It's not going to hold after that. The tension's going to break through, but he does a good job in calming that. He very much centralizes the kingdom because, Saul spent the whole time in battle. There wasn't a lot of time to run a system. He begins construction on a permanent temple, which was a big deal for the religion. to not have the temporary temple, but to have now a place to have a permanent temple. And there was a lot of emphasis on farming communities and trade. And because of these things, you end up with consolidating and growing a kingdom, essentially, right? That's what this stuff is. And that's going to allow it to be at a wealthy place when Solomon takes over. Okay, so that's David. Then we have his son, Solomon. And Solomon is popular mostly because David was. He had some aspects of it, but Solomon inherited a kingdom that was doing well, and he worked to expand it further through trade and increase in wealth. He built a merchant fleet. He had construction on a palace, finished the temple, right? So there you have these massive building projects that brought the kingdom of Israel to its height. However, it was built on taxes and corvée, right, which is that labor tax, and this was largely from farmers. So this created a problem where you had an increasing divide between what was seen as the country and urban center, specifically with the farmers versus the priests. And this created social tension and issues. There was also increasing tribal discontent, where there were claims that he favored Judah, the tribe of Judah, over the others. He also was excessively, it will say extreme luxury, wealth, and flaunting it, which didn't go over well with increase in taxes and everything else. He had stables built for 450 horses that were all his. Right? It's just excess. Right? That extreme luxury and wealth is more like excess of stuff that's unnecessary, especially when you are increasing taxes on people of the lower classes and forcing them to do forced or labor for taxes. And here you are building massive stables for an excessive number of horses and just lavish court life. He did like his luxury items. And then on top of that, he supposedly had, like 300 wives and 750 concubines was the popular number. Now, even if it wasn't that many, they had a whole separate palace built for wives and concubines. Right? So the key with all this and the purpose is just excess. Right? And especially at a time when you have taxes and people that weren't doing as well. And this creates the discontent that ultimately leads to the split. So let's see, what number are we on? 5 here. After Solomon's death, Solomon's son takes over very, very briefly. But Solomon was able to hold on and keep that group together because of David. Solomon's son didn't have that same connection to David that allowed him to hold on, and so they split, right? And it becomes into two groups. You have the kingdom of Judah, which were the two tribes that were loyal to Solomon and his son, And then you have the kingdom of Israel with 10 tribes. So the problem with this is that they did this at the worst possible time. Right? Because what's the problem with division? Well, you're weaker, right? 2 tribes and 10 tribes is weaker. They also did this right around the time that societies were recovering from 1200 BC. So when they should have been at their strongest, they end up at their weakest, which just makes it even easier to be conquered. Right? And so, not surprisingly, that's what happens. The first takes place with the Assyrians in 722 BCE. They conquer the kingdom of Israel. Come on. They defeat the kingdom of Israel. Now, this becomes, I was going to write the 10 lost tribes if it's going to let me erase here. Maybe. There we go. So this becomes the 10 lost tribes. And the reason for that is because they defeat the kingdom of Israel. And remember, what is it that the Assyrians do? They not only terror as a method of control, but what was the second thing? Deportation, right? You move people around the kingdom, the Assyrian kingdom, so that they can't have a unified society, that they're less likely to be able to rebel, which is what it worked. Mass deportation. Those tribes, why it's the 10 lost tribes is because they kind of lost their identity to those tribes and as Hebrews, because they ultimately kind of merged into the cultures and people that they were spread around to, because they weren't kept together as a cohesive group. And then you have Neo-Babylonians that take over the kingdom of Judah. They were the Chaldeans, the people, but it was called Neo-Babylonia. This was in 586 BC. So the kingdom of Judah held on longer, just mostly because they weren't attacked by the Assyrians. They conquered the kingdom of Judah. And now there is no more independent kingdom of Israel or kingdom of Judah. They destroyed Solomon's temple, or David and Solomon's temple, and took all of their, they don't have gods, right? But the Neo-Babylonians would confiscate the gods of the people they conquered and bring them back and store them in this room of conquest, essentially. But they stole like the ceremonial plates and the things that were in the temple that were relics and important things. They took all of those and they put it into their vault, essentially. And then what they did is that they brought the young upper class boys to Babylon. And right, this is where it was different, because then they were trained in Babylonian custom, language, and government, with the expectation that they would work for the king as kind of the bureaucrats, right? And the belief was this. So the king at this time was Nebuchadnezzar, or Nebuchadrezzar, same person, just different translation. This is during the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the hanging gardens of Babylon. And this was their view so the Assyrians, to prevent rebellion, deported people all over the Assyrian kingdom. The Babylonians, to prevent rebellion, incorporated young aristocratic boys into their society to have them essentially end up being invested and identify more as Babylonian. And in that case, it was pretty effective. So it's this weird mix of like, they weren't captives, but they weren't really free to go, but they could get married. They got paid. They lived decently well, as long as they fell in line and learned and did what they were supposed to do in that process. And they, like I said, became advisors and administrators to, you know, the Babylonian government and structure. And this was this period of captivity for Israel. And then the last phase is just seen as restoration to a degree, right? And then this is the period where you have the Persians under Cyrus, who makes them a tributary state, right? So Cyrus conquers Babylon. And then what he does is all the people that were conquered and those that were slightly captive, right? They were free to go back home. They were given religious items and allowed to rebuild the temple, as long as they paid tribute, right? And this was a tactic for ingratiating people so they wouldn't want to rebel as well. Each one of these is all about how do we make sure people don't rebel. But here's the key, right? They were never independent again. Now, they loved Cyrus, in part because he allowed them to go back. He allowed them to restore their temple and their religious practices. A lot of people chose not to go because they had been incorporated into the Neo-Babylonian system. That was Cyrus was around 538 or so when they were allowed to go and rebuild. So some did. But a lot chose to stay. So it just shows how effective the Neo-Babylonian system was without requiring you to just, mass deport and murder people like the Assyrians did. But that's the key, right, is that you are now a tributary state, and this requires that you pay taxes and men for the military. But Cyrus gets put up as this kind of savior to the Israelites because of allowing them to go back. And then from there you have Alexander the Great. So if we look at never independent again, it goes Persia, Alexander the Great, and then Rome. / Greeks. There's some other Greeks that control them in between, and then Rome. And by the time they get to Rome, this will lead us, when we talk about Christianity, we'll revisit this spot right here. They are kind of bitter. So Cyrus Great, by the time you get through Rome, dislike Rome, bitter about Rome, want to overthrow Rome, even though logistically it's impossible for them based on size and strength. But again, key, right, is this very short period of independence. All right, the last thing then we're looking at is the religion. All right, as I mentioned, right, what's unique with this is that they were monotheistic. So it's one God. But there's some other differences about this as well, especially if you compare it to polytheistic religions. So let's look at the characteristics of polytheistic for a second, which is, again, multiple gods. So what you have here is that with polytheistic religions, you tend to have sacrifice. So, and we'll see, some of these are going to be the same. Some are going to be different. You have sacrifice, you have temples and priests. The gods can be born, right? The gods can die. They have human characteristics. And we're looking at specifically here Mesopotamian characteristics, because of course each polytheistic religion is slightly different. So the characteristics I'm writing are Mesopotamian. I think that's appropriate for comparing and contrasting because of the Hebrews kind of originating from Mesopotamia. It's interesting to see how like their religion has some connection to that as well. They can make mistakes. Let's see. They also, you have anger, jealousy, right, etc. These emotions. I mean, so those are some of them, right? That this idea that the gods can be born, they can die, they're not all-knowing, they can be tricked, they tend to be fickle and uncaring. Okay, so it's like those are just some of the characters, right? We can keep going, but that's some of it. So then let's look at here, we'll put it over here and look at with the Hebrew God, right? What are the things that are similarities and differences? Well, they do sacrifice, right? The animals, grain, things like that. You do have a temple and priest, so that's the same. But the God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and always existed. So that's a significant difference. No human characteristics, right? There's no idol, right? That's another one. Right? They have statues to represent them, or what the Hebrews called idols. Right? There's no human characteristics and no idols. Then that's a significant break from like polytheistic religions. You do have a loving side, but it's also important to emphasize that there is also one that has God shows anger, jealousy, and emotions, and is not fickle, but can be harsh. Right? We could put punishment, which we see that you do have with the Mesopotamians, although that comes like more like with the penitential prayer to every god. Prior to that, people are just kind of, bad things happen to you. It isn't necessarily punishment for anything you did. The gods are just pissed. So we have some similarities, right? The anger, the jealousy, the emotions, the being harsh, and punishment, the temples, the sacrifice, those are very, very similar. But then you have a huge break from this idea of God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and always existed, and there are no human characteristics that can that define God, and you certainly don't have idols with that. The other thing that is significant within this is this idea of free will. That people are responsible for their actions. And that matters, right? And there are consequences to it. You can choose to follow the covenant of God. You can choose not to. And that definitely goes to this one of this idea of moral autonomy. It's both this idea of, one, you're responsible for your actions, that there's a moral obligation. We see this, the first time we see this is with the New Kingdom Egypt, right? In behavior. But ultimately, because of free will, you have the choice whether you follow that or not, right? It also is about individuality. and your choice on whether you follow the moral obligation and the rules and requirements or whether you don't. And then, of course, there's that huge focus on the covenant and law and the idea of history matters, all of which were new concepts in that. But then also if we bring this one over here for that minute, the loving side, right, is that yes, there's anger, there's wrath, and that's definitely present and very much feels like the harsh. Especially if you add Christianity to the mix later and you look at Old Testament God versus New Testament God. New Testament God is with Christianity and the Roman period. Old Testament God is with the Hebrews and the Israelites and is connected to Mesopotamia and that region and era. Old Testament God is much harsher and meaner and strict and brutal at times compared to the New Testament God. And part of that has to do with the location, right? The connection to Mesopotamia is very clear, I think, when you compare and contrast how God is portrayed in the Old versus New Testament. Whereas by the time you get to the Roman gods, God is much more loving and caring all the time and friendlier, and someone you're supposed to call him father and approach him and that type of stuff. This God here has the anger and the wrath and is harsh, but at the same time, the unique side that the Mesopotamians never had is that he's loving and he cares. Right? God cares about his people. And we say his just because it's easy, but technically God doesn't have a gender. And that he wants them to succeed, and he's never going to completely reject them, right? Which that gets us back to looking at this again in that context, right? And here we see, here's the positive, here's the reward of following God, but right, listen, this sounds like Mesopotamian gods to a degree, right? You break the covenant, then you're struck with diseases, blindness and depression, your enemies eat the crops, you will be attacked, your pride will be crushed, there'll be no rain, so there'll be a drought, right? All of that's pretty harsh, and that can last for generations, right? And so you see that kind of more, like I said, Mesopotamian kind of harshness, never fickle though, and I think that's a clear difference. The Mesopotamian gods you never know what you're going to get, and that's very much reflective of the geography. With the Hebrew God, he's consistent. And it's very clear cut. You either follow the covenant and good things happen, or you failed to follow the covenant and bad things happen. There's a reason for it. So it's less capricious, essentially, than the Mesopotamian gods. But you still have that kind of anger, wrath, harshness component to it. But then you have the positive, loving, caring, providing part that the Mesopotamians don't have. And then ultimately this idea that of loyalty, that God's never going to reject the people completely, that he'll always come back and that they can always redeem themselves. And that's a huge concept of redemption, right? And we'll say loyalty, that those components are part of that are in that. Okay, so that's what's the unique stuff: free will, moral autonomy, redemption, and loyalty. The idea of an all-powerful, all-knowing, always existing in deity. That's all new. And we'll see the free will, moral autonomy part be important in coming into other things. But this is also why why history matters. Because if you have the free will and the moral autonomy to make those decisions, then you're responsible for the consequences. And then understanding what those are and how that happened is important for not making those same mistakes in the future. All right, we're going to talk about the Persians and a very interesting and oppressive Persian Empire next time.